Okay, so we have a little demo for some rock formations today. These ones from Zion, beautiful pictures. So we're gonna pull out some colors first. I'm gonna begin by basing the entire area with a wet wash. I'm working on a hot press paper, so I don't have any natural texture in the paper. It actually would probably be helpful to use a cold press paper for this. And then I'm going to start working in shadows and blocking in some shapes. There's two little like indents in the rock here that I'm carving shapes out for. By working wet into wet, I'm going to get softer edges and that sort of nicely diffused section, but also remembering that's going to dry down a lot lighter. But I like working wet into wet whenever I'm using something to create more like modeling in colors. So I've let this area dry. I did some spatter over it before I dried, which I definitely forgot to put in the video. It helps to just start breaking up the texture. We're still gonna start working wet into wet, but I'm working with blue shadows now. When we're looking at the rock formations, you're gonna exaggerate a little bit some of the colors you're seeing underneath. Blue's gonna help the shadows kind of get darker. They're going to help them seem more saturated, and they're going to help them recede. So I'm not worrying about mixing it too much. There's a lot of orange in these rocks, pinks in these rocks, different colors. By the time I get them all layered up, this will not look so blue. So still using a fairly large brush, still working pretty wet, just modeling, building out shapes, building some construction of it, essentially building the structure out. I'm adding some purple into those, just dipping my brush, it's fairly loaded with pigment, not a lot of water on it now, into these wet washes to try to get some like blooming and saturation in our shadows. The purple helps get it closer to our rock color and also just gives it some different variations, some texture. If you put a layer of water down line like that and then you load your brush with pigment and lay it along the side, it will naturally diffuse while still staying stronger on that side. So here that is entirely dry. I'm using a blow dryer to push it along. I'm gonna start building up more of the local color now. So I've got a kind of rosy pinkish tone. It looks pretty hot on my brush, but watered down and laid over all of this has a lot less punch. So that's helping to warm us up. It's helping to get us a little bit of that kind of red rocks feel. I've mixed my orange with a bit of that dark blue I was using for shadows to create this sort of like muddy brown color. And I'm moving my brush both vertically for the fissures, but then whenever I'm working across a large section, I'm gonna start working on horizontal strokes to create the sort of like layers of shale that build up inside the rock. Right now they're all gonna look still very soft, but that impression will build up with each consecutive layer we do. Think about when you do those lines across, stopping at indents, sort of like when we follow the line of a skirt in a pattern and it dips and forms around the ruffles or the bins in the skirt, the gathers in the skirt. The rock formation is going to do the same thing. So when it goes into those little indents, it's going to drop or raise in order to sell that that's a different plane of space. Still working at bumping up those shadows. I'm working with a bit of teal now. So there's a few areas of rock that have a little bit cooler tone, a little teal. So those I'm straight into teal. Since it's watercolor, when it layers over, the colors mute themselves. I've got a brush here. It's kind of a dry brush technique that you could use to build up some shaliness. This is with a white gouache mixed with a touch of gray. You can see that it's always going to fade in, but it just gives us some general texture. I'm actually going to use colored pencils at the end of this to do that, but I just wanted to show you could do it with gouache if you want, to do a little bit of the lightening and the outlining around the different front facade of the rock versus these little indents we've got, and along the sides of some of the fissures. White gouache always dries so much lighter than you thought it was going to be. It looks really punchy when you put it down and then it just sort of like settles. It's really nice. But remember that it does have movement and it's going to affect your colors that layer over it. So if you have white gouache down and you work with watercolor on top of it, they're going to diffuse over it. They won't get as dark either. It's kind of a nice way to preserve some texture as we go over this again with our darker colors. Bumping up my shadows, I'm using a pretty heavy pigment now, not a lot of water, and working much more dry, so everything underneath is dry, except for those little areas of gouache, which dry a little quicker. And so continuing to add texture to build up shadows in that horizontal shale approach. So these are less about structure, less about figuring out the fissures and the depths of field, but more about just creating texture over the whole thing. Using that pink mixed with a bit of orange and a deeper blue, sending in a tiny bit purple to help bump some of the shadows, but keep them from getting too poppy, too orange. Sort of an overall model, lots of different colors participating in it, is how we develop this rock color that has all these different interesting and beautiful variations. So this is a bit of green mixed with blue and a touch of black, and I'm adding it with kind of like a stippling motion, but it's wet into wet, so it's blooming. That's how I'm kind of creating some of that like lichen feeling that you see in that one fissure that's following across the top. It also kind of shows that there's like little areas chipping off, things like that. And then I'm using it to bump forward and create some shaping in a few of the horizontal textures. Then using red with quite a bit of water in it just to like glaze over some areas, or not red, orange, and create a little bit more punch. And then another layer up here, there's a whole section that's like kind of turquoisey. It's a little cooler in tone. So I used turquoise over all of that area. So here's where I'm talking about using a white colored pencil. I like using colored pencils on top of things like this when you want that kind of soft texture. So if I did this with watercolor white or gouache white, it would actually be a little punchier, it would be soft, it would be, you know, watercolor lends itself to smooth transitions. By using a colored pencil and just kind of lightly going over areas, I can feather it out, I can create that texture that actually kind of sells the rock. So I'm defining the edges of things as they come forward and then feathering out along them in that horizontal way that the kind of emphasizing some highlights both in the texture and in the structure. And we don't want to cover the whole thing, of course. We're picking and choosing areas to make lighter that make sense to the structure that you're working with and also that in the overall composition of the piece. So for us, I've lightened that whole upper section a little bit. It looks like that's like coming at us more, and then there's a dip under a fissure, and then this is all receded back from that plane. And then we have these two little fissures that are kind of cut out. I want the areas around them to come forward. And then I want a little bit of this like texturizing around them to show where things have chipped away, where the different layers of shale have been like eaten out by centuries in different depths. Showing how that one thin crack runs the length of the thing, giving some definition in our shadows. So I hope that that helps.